Okay, so let's move to session number 1. And in this session, and I'm going to do this in all the sessions if I can move my PowerPoints, I'm going to give you a little introduction. And we'll talk first about the physical properties of solar power and the photoelectric effect. And we'll talk about that at an extraordinarily high level just so you get some fundamental understanding. And that's really the same with discussing the characteristics of different types of mono or polysilicon or thin film technology, just to get a very general idea. Once we've done that, we'll go through some of the initial feed-in tariffs starting in about 2004 and compare that to some of the more current bids to demonstrate the absolutely dramatic kind of change in solar power. And then we'll discuss why these power prices for solar power have changed so dramatically. And we'll talk about the real drivers of what's caused the change. And that includes the capital expenditure, operating costs, and the financing cost, and also the resource. Okay, and I'm skipping a couple of things there because we're just going to talk about the photoelectric effect. All right, and there was a man, if I can pronounce his name correctly, Edmund Becquerel. He's French, and he came up with the idea, okay, when he was quite young, and he said, okay, how do we convert the sunlight into electricity? And then I'm going to skip around a diagram. I'm going to go back and forth here. But basically, the idea is you've got some sunlight with some energy, protons from the sun, and they hit a top layer, and this top layer excites some electrons. The electrons go through conducting material like silicon, and then it goes to a bottom layer, and so we have the cells are constructed from conductive materials, and when the protons hit the top layer, they give you enough energy to knock some of those little electrons down to the bottom layer. And then the bottom layer is connected to the top layer, and that creates an electric current. Okay, that's about all I can tell you because it's at a very high level. We just need to know a little tiny bit about that. And so when you talk about a cell, that's a little cell here, it's one of these little things, they're accumulated to a module and accumulated to an array. We typically talk about the cost of one of these modules. Okay, they produce a little bit of power, and then you can produce more and more of them and get more electric power. Now, some of the really there, I think we'll talk primarily about 3 times. We won't talk much about concentrating uh, uh, photovoltaic. We'll talk about 2 different kinds of silicon. One, monosilicon, which is just made from the same source of silicon, and apparently that's the most efficient. When I talk about efficiency in solar power, you've got to be really careful. Efficiency doesn't really affect the cost. You measure cost in terms of cost per kilowatt output. The thing that efficiency measures is how many modules you have to put there to get that kilowatt, and that affects the area. And if you have very cheap land, you don't care at all about efficiency. If you have you're limited to a rooftop and want a whole bunch of power from your rooftop, you care very much about the efficiency. And then there's a polysilicon, which is probably the most common kind of module, and that's created from different sources of silicon. And then there's this thin film, and they use some kind of, again, conductive materials, silicon or this kind of conductive material, and they essentially paint this onto a base. Now let's look at how they're really made. The reason I'm showing you this is when you think about what's happened to the cost, you should think about what you're really doing. And when you think about businesses, you should think about, okay, what's going to drive things? The first thing is you get some sand, and then you heat it really hot to get something like this, and then you cut it into these little bars. You cut it again, and then you use some technology to put this cell together, to put the top and bottom layer on. It's essentially taking a lot of sand. It's driven by silicon and the cost of the silicon. All right. And then if we look at a thin film, you've got some layers basically, and you paint some. You essentially you paint might be a too simplistic of a word, but you put some conducting material kind of on a base. They call it a substrate. Okay, and I'm going to introduce this simplistic kind of diagram again and again and again, and I just want you to get the fundamental idea that there are some things you cannot control. I think somebody upstairs, who knows what you believe in, but somebody else controls how much sun comes down and how many clouds there are, and maybe even dust and things like that. Okay? You don't get to control that. They can control what's nighttime and what's daytime. You get to control, and that's where these different technologies come in. You get to control what kind of panels you put in. You get to control how you convert the electricity at a direct current that comes from these panels and puts it into the grid. You get to control how these things are tilted, or if they use a tracking system. You get to control the wiring. You get to control the cleaning of the panels. These are all related to the performance ratio. So we don't control some things, of course, and we control others. That's where the performance ratio comes in. It measures the final output, including the controllable items, relative to the non-controllable sunlight that just hits the array. You can call this effective irradiation on the collectors, or you can call this in-plane radiation, whatever, just to understand. And these things took me a long time to really get why. Just kind of making a performance ratio, talking about one, you really want to understand what they are. We're going to come back to that. So there are a few notes on polysilicon versus thin film. Chinese companies now really dominate the market. Polysilicon is the major technology that's really used. Its performance, apparently, if you have a lot of cloudy areas, times you get a little bit less from the polysilicon, and there's a difference in the way the temperature affects the panels. The thin film are less efficient, meaning you need more land. They have a better, something called a temperature coefficient, so they don't go down as much when the temperature increases. That's just a little bit of background on what we're talking about. Now let's go through some economic history of solar power. And for me, this graph says so much. Now, please don't yell at me about not updating this graph. This is when the feed-in tariffs were stopped. The government of Germany decided to embark on a policy, and it decided to give major subsidies. When I show you just how big these subsidies are, I think it's kind of remarkable. And their idea, from a policy standpoint, was that, okay, we're going to get this market started. We're going to create scale. And when you create scale, bigger and bigger companies will come in, and the more companies will come in, they'll compete with each other in a more rigorous way. We'll get economies of scale, and the cost will come down. And my God, it really worked. Now, we stopped here at 9.47 just to give you an idea of what this is. One of the things I hope you'll get really familiar with very quickly is that when you hear euro cents per kilowatt hour, if you're going to pay for a megawatt hour, you'll pay 1,000 times this. 4570 and with another 0 cents, but then you divide it by 100. So if you want to convert this to euros per megawatt hour, you multiply by 1,000, divide it by 100, that means you're multiplying by 10. So this would be 450 euros per megawatt hour. This is another thing. I think this is such a dramatic kind of way to introduce what's really happened to solar power that I've shown you this. They had a higher subsidy if you put it on the rooftop than if you put a ground mounted, and they would do all sorts of studies that said, here's how much a module cost, and here's how much power we can get out of the module, and all the rest of it. To give you a context, remember this number, 45.7. Here's the merchant power market in Germany. And the merchant power market, you see, number one, we're going to keep coming back to this. You can see there's a correlation. I think this is a pretty close correlation between electricity and gas prices. It's not perfect. In some markets, it's even closer than this. Okay. And the price on a merchant basis here we look at this scale, it was about 3 euro cents. 3.45. That's how much of a subsidy was given. Now, you talk to people from Germany, they might be complaining about their electricity bills, but it got the market going. And maybe even in the worst case, oh my gosh, the gas price went up and then the electricity price went to 7 cents, but that's not very close to 45, and it's not even close to the 9.47 that was at the end. Now, let's keep going. This was stopped in about 2014. Here, in 2015, there was a bid. I remember this bid very, very well. It was a bid for 6 cents power. And people were saying, oh my gosh. And there were no subsidies here, no subsidies whatsoever, no kind of special, extra payments or anything else. They bid 6 cents. And people thought this was so remarkable and it was really going to change the world. That was 2015. Let's move ahead to today. Well, maybe not to today, but as of January 2021, we get 1.104 cents, 1.239 cents. And that you might say, that's just in the desert. But in Portugal, you get 1.3 cents. New Mexico in the U.S., that might be subsidized a little, 1.5 cents. Another one in Portugal, one in Ethiopia for 2.52 cents. That's really a remarkable one. Okay, Uzbekistan, 2.7 cents. This is the revolution that I'm talking about. And the interesting thing about here is now, if we're comparing, we're not making a fair comparison whatsoever, but the cost of the solar power is less than the merchant price, not greater than the merchant price. Of course, you couldn't do this in Germany, so I'm being a little bit extreme, but I'm just trying to show you just what the dramatic change has been. Now you say, what's causing this change? Well, the first one, and that's a pretty obvious one, is the cost. The upfront capital cost has dramatically fallen. And we'll study that really in the next session. Okay, other equipment has come down as well. The whole situation has become much more competitive. Resources, the amount of money you get from the amount of sunlight you get has changed. I remember when we were first looking at it, it was very difficult to find how much solar power there really was in different areas. Now we'll see, you click on a little Google type map and you get the numbers. Might not be perfect numbers, by the way. We really have to track the numbers. And now, a few years ago, if a bank saw tracking, oh my God, the bank would say, "Oh no, there's some mechanical parts to this. We can't accept that." Now it's common. Bifacial means you put the solar panel on the bottom and the top, depending where you are. That can be a big deal. If you're in the desert and that sunlight reflects on that sand pretty strongly, that gives you a whole bunch of extra resources. So those resources, it's not only the capital cost, the resources have changed, the operating costs, well, they might not have changed quite as much, but they've come down. We've got more a little more transparency on what's going on. We have to be very careful with operating costs to include everything, including insurance and taxes and the cost of any land you might have. So when you're comparing one with another, we've got to be kind of a little bit careful. And then the financing costs have also dramatically changed, and all sorts of financiers are so much more comfortable with not only the credit of solar power, but willing to invest at shockingly kind of low costs of capital on the equity. So those are the real drivers, and we're going to go through these drivers one by one by one. Okay, and the way to kind of start this, I think I put a little picture of something level. We're going to levelize out the cost. That's leveled. It's not a confusing thing. It just means we're going to flatten out the cost. And we're going to talk about, show you to really understand which driver is the most important. Well, they all are, but in different ways, especially the capital cost and the resource analysis. Okay. We'll be able to test out different strategies with the levelized cost. We'll be able to assess different business ideas, whether tracking makes sense, for example, whether bifacial makes sense, what kind of cost you can expect for a rooftop versus a ground-mounted system. Okay, and then we'll also introduce a little bit of mechanical financial issues. Now, the intuition of LCOE, I think it's so important in this industry, because you can say, what's the cost of the solar compared to my electricity bill? What's the cost of solar compared to turning off a gas plant, the variable cost? What's the cost of solar, which is really kind of a little bit inappropriate, compared to the overall total cost of running a coal plant or a gas plant? What happens if you include environmental effects? Now, incorporating things like inflation and different financing costs will be absolutely crucial in this example, and that's where we're going to next. Now, when I think about levelized cost, here's what happened. I was listening to a little show about Beethoven. And Beethoven was so wonderful. What a radical, but he got drunk a lot. And he had a horse, and he didn't take care of his horse. So as soon as I heard of Beethoven's horse, I said, what's the levelized cost of his horse? We could compare the levelized cost of a horse to an electricity vehicle, to a petrol vehicle. We could compare all these things. And whenever we do any kind of economic analysis to understand why these prices are changing so much, what we need the capital cost, and we need to spread that or levelize out that capital cost. That's where the cost of capital comes into play, and we have to divide it into different periods. That's actually the little trickiest part. And we have to divide it by how much you're going to ride the horse or how much electricity you're going to produce. We need upfront cost, operating cost, production, and some way to move that capital cost over time. That's what we need to do. And what I find so objectionable is you Google something like the Levelized LCOE study and you get the nice answers and the nice graphs. Wouldn't it be nice for you to do it yourself, you to really understand it, and you to make sensitivity analysis, and you to use this for your own business assessment? And I suppose I just kind of stated some of these things, but just to repeat, we need the upfront cost, the operation cost, the quantity, and then we also have to account for the life of the asset, because that defines how much you're going to spread it over time with. We need the cost of debt and equity, we need degradation, we need taxes. Those are all the drivers. And we'll be able to understand why this price in Germany of 45 euro cents per kilowatt hour can become somewhere around 1 cent in Saudi Arabia today. What a dramatic kind of change. And when we do this, we need a couple of numbers. We need to understand that a megawatt is 1,000 times a kilowatt, and a kilowatt is 1,000 times a watt. And sometimes we state things in kilowatts, and sometimes watts, and sometimes megawatts, or gigawatts even. We need to understand when we multiply or divide by 1,000. These are tough things for me, but I hope you'll get them. And we need to convert from years to hours. Some costs are stated per year, like an interest cost or operation and maintenance cost, and some are stated at the end. We want things per hour. And that's the idea of levelized cost, because when you pay your electricity bill, you pay it per kilowatt hour. Sometimes if you're a really big company, it's per kilowatt, but basically per kilowatt hour. It provides the benchmark for which we can compare things. Sometimes I say 8766 because you know that one day in February every 4 years, when they used to have the Olympics, was 24 extra hours, and you divide that 24 by 4, and 6 times 4 is 24. So really you say 8766 hours when we really do it correctly. Okay, and I have this example. If you want to compare a kilowatt year to a kilowatt hour, you take this kilowatt year and you divide it by 8766, and you get it per kilowatt hour. Okay, and you don't actually, I was wrong, you don't actually divide it by 8766, you divide it by 8766 times what percentage of the year are you operating actually at full capacity. That's the capacity factor. And then if you want to get it in megawatt hours, you better multiply it by 1,000, because if I'm paying 1 for a kilowatt hour, I'm going to pay 1,000 times more for a megawatt hour. And if you want to express it in cents, you take the cost per megawatt hour and divide it by 10. It's that whole business we already did. Okay, and then you figure out how many months, years, and hours you have. That's it. And finally, if we want to, I guess I've got 2 slides. Excuse me. Finally, if we want to really talk about how this process will work, we start with our total capital cost, and that's expressed in benchmark terms per kilowatt. It's not per kilowatt year. It's not per kilowatt hour. It's per upfront kilowatt. And we take something called a carrying charge rate, and you don't get intimidated by this carrying charge rate one tiny bit. You just take this percentage, and then you can figure out what it is per kilowatt year. And then hopefully the operating cost is already stated in per kilowatt year, and you get the total annual cost. And then we're going to talk about yields and capacity factors and all sorts of different things. But in solar, you often compute the kilowatt hours, the sum of the hours, generally for a year, and you call that the yield, divided by the kWp. Then you call it the yield. And if you really take away the P, it's kWh divided by kW. That gives you hours. And that's a nice, convenient way to convert from kW year to kWh. And finally, you take the cost up here, the total annual cost per kilowatt year, divided by the hours. If you want to multiply it by 1,000, you can, and you get the levelized cost. So you're not going to be intimidated by doing this. We have to understand what the total cost is, what the carrying charge is, what the operating cost is, and what the yield is. That's what we really have to understand, and that's going to take us a little while. Now, there are some complications to this that we'll go through. We need to understand how we're going to adjust for inflation. The right way to do this is to measure the cost in today's currency, not in some mythical future level currency. We have to adjust for degradation and for taxes and for tax depreciation. We have to really understand what kind of costs of capital go into the IRR. That's where we're going through. And we'll discuss each of these kind of little more complicated adjustments in turn. And so session 1 is finished.